Welcome to Conversations, Mark Adamo, whose new opera, Lysistrata, you just saw an excerpt from. Conversations is Lehman College's series of discussions with major theater and musical figures of our time. Our guest today, for the first of a two-part chat, is my old friend, the brilliantly gifted composer, librettist, Mark Adamo. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bill. Great to be here.
Mark, you're the only person we've interviewed twice so far on the show. We interviewed a series with John Corigliano, but you are appearing for the second a solo appearance. And
I'll try to get it right this time.
Because your career, since the last time we talked to you, you were in the midst of mounting Little Women, and since then your career has blossomed, and so it's really exciting to see you. New York City will soon have the pleasure of seeing the premiere of Lysistrata or the Nude Goddess.
Yes, exactly.
Did I get the title right?
Yes. I mean, a lot of people pronounce it Lysistrata. The argument is that because it's actually a Latin version of the Greek original. If the Greek original would be Lysistrate or some vowel equivalent thereof, because it's a Latinization ending in A, the stress is on the second syllable, which is generally how our friends across the pond pronounce it. I think it should be pronounced Tosca myself, but Lysistrata actually is the way it should be pronounced.
And
I'm
sure I'm going to do it both ways today, and I'm going to stumble, so you'll have to forgive me. It's going to open, am I right, on March 31st?
No, March 21st.
March 21st. At the New York City Opera.
Precisely.
And the year is 2006.
2006.
And it's going to happen imminently.
Yes.
And I'll be there.
Okay.
And we just saw a delicious excerpt from it. In the version, the premiere version, the world premiere was done at the Houston Grand Opera.
Precisely.
Directed by Michael Kahn.
Yes.
And what we saw was the ending of Act 1, in which the Athenian soldiers and the Spartan soldiers tried to end the sex strike of the women to end the Greek wars.
Right. Right.
May I ask you, now the play upon which this is based, or shall I say leaps off from into the stratosphere.
It's a free variation thereupon, yes.
In Ghosts of Versailles, I suggested that they, I have my play, my libretto, say, suggested by La Mère Coupable of Beaumarchais.
Right.
How do you phrase your attribution to Aristophanes?
Freely adapted from.
Freely adapted from.
Which is a way of saying that it's the premise and the title and three scenes. And the rest of the libretto is essentially an attempt to make an opera based on the play that I think we remember, which is not exactly the play that he wrote. Because if you look at the script as it's generally staged, now, it's generally only used in two functions, I would argue, in our current cultural life. It's either the carrot of sex with which we lure students to the study of the Greek theater, or it's the megaphone of protest through which we assail the war du jour. And the problem with the play as written is that it's really not a character piece. It's not terribly interested in human ambiguity, which, among other things, explains, I think, why, while you have Vanessa Redgrave or Zoe Caldwell or any of the leading English-speaking actresses regularly appearing in Hecuba or Medea or whatnot, Lysistrata has been quite conspicuous in its failure to attract leading players because it's really a cartoon in the form of a sexual vaudeville. It's really not a character piece. And so one of the reasons that this piece is as loosely adapted as you've observed is because I looked at it and thought I really... while I respect the political certainty of Aristophanes' title character, and I respect the political urgency out of which he wrote this very unnuanced piece, it's pretty uninteresting dramatically if everything is solved up front. And so what I did was essentially take, again, the title, or the premise, which is the idea that the women of Athens and Sparta join together and swear a sanction on sex until their men make peace. I kept that torso of it, but essentially filled it with all new characters who are living in a much more fraught ambivalent, self-arguing state than his characters were. So while, I mean, as opposed to Little Women, I would like to think that if Louisa May Alcott were here, she would say, terribly well done, we need to talk about royalties. I think if Aristophanes were here, he would say, you'll be hearing from my attorney, because this is not my play. But that was on purpose.
Should we view this as your contribution to the anti-war canon?
It's happened that way, although it was inadvertent. Because this is going to go up in 2002. I was late, as I frequently am. I hope never to be late again, but and that would have been, it would have been, had the premiere gone up as scheduled the spring following 9/11. And I remember very specifically submitting the libretto to Houston Grand Opera a year, almost to the week before 9/11, and thinking, as I reread the script before I put it in the FedEx envelope, that I was happy with what I had done with it as a dramatic arch, as a character study. But going back to what I had said earlier, I thought, but I wonder if anyone is going to be interested in a new Lysistrata in peacetime, because we only dust the piece off whenever we're at war, and we're not at war. And so, in a rather cruel twist of fate, I would argue the piece is much more topical than it was ever planned to be. And quite honestly, after 9/11 happened, I had not looked at the libretto for a while because I was doing other things. I think I was visiting this or that production of Little Women, and I looked back on it because, so much changed, forgive the cliche, but we all woke up different that morning, and I was almost afraid to look at it again, because I thought, I hope that I believe in everything that I think I believe, because now it matters in a way that before was achingly theoretical. And it was a great relief to me when I looked at it and said, no, I still believe every word, actually. And that's when I got very grateful that it was going to go up, because it seems to me that we need it more now than we did in '02. And I'm very grateful that it is not a propaganda piece, because we've had plenty of propaganda in the past 4 years. And it hasn't done us a whole lot of good, I would argue.
Do you think politics have any place in opera?
Yeah, I do. I think that everything is political in a certain way. I think I guess another way of answering that question, or framing that question, is that what part does history play in opera? Because I think that's actually a little trickier. One of the reasons that I like this piece is that it does what fiction always does, what actually the plays in High Athens did. What I did not know, for example, when I was doing research for this piece, was that something like the Oresteia, even to its original audience, was 100 or so years in the past. Even that original classical theater was in one way neoclassical. It was a way of taking figures that were so far removed from that audience in history that you could talk about them almost with the freedom of fiction. And so you could get at certain, archetypal things, certain human conflicts that had to do with the current historical and political landscape, as everything does, but was still far enough removed that you could see it in a kind of useful isolation. Whereas if you have a piece that is based on current events, as we've had a number of operas in the past 10 years, you always have sort of the awkward problem of remembering this particular character from what he or she said, or how it was reported, or what the very specific historical context is, based as opposed to what the composer and the librettist are doing with it. And inevitably there's going to be some fictionalizing or softening, or I don't want to say dishonest, but it's not going to be, you're always going to be conscious of what's being made up and what is not.
As in Nixon in China.
As in the Adams operas, there's a lot of what they call the CNN school, a number of historical figures. And there's been, great work and serious work done there, but I think that it is at root problematic. Whereas, in a way, to come back to your original question, I do believe that art is at its best when it pertains to what we're doing politically, but I think that's kind of why God made fiction. I think it's a more useful instrument. Among other things, I am more in control of my argument. One of the things that happened in this piece, for example, I want to be very, very specific about it. In my war, which is not the Peloponnesian War, which is what the play was, no character on stage and no one in the audience has access to first-hand information about how it started. So, for example, in my conflict, it is now about an almost deserted island that the Athenians laid claim to, the Spartans laid claim to 70 years ago. They're removed in generation from the people who actually were there at the time, and at no point does a native of the island come on and say, I was 10 years old at the time and here's what really happened. Because I wanted to make very, very sure that those people on stage lived in the world in which we live, which is we have to make huge decisions as citizens based largely on secondhand information. We don't know what's going on really in Iraq. We don't, it's competing media, the mainstream media versus the blogosphere, for example. And yet we have to make responsible decisions as Americans, and that's not something that you can do if you're bringing historical characters to which we have access. Recent historical characters to which we have access, it blurs, and you as an artist sort of lose the ability to say just what you want to say and nothing else.
I am enchanted listening. I've heard the piece, and I'm well acquainted with the libretto. I haven't seen the whole production. I can't wait to see it.
That's the New York premiere.
That's right. And I'm just astonished how personal you make this story.
Thank you.
It's so
that
beautiful.
Was the goal.
It's so beautiful. I thought we should play another excerpt. We're going to play a few excerpts from it. And in the excerpt, we're going to see Myrrhine, played by Lakita Mitchell, seduces her, or tries to seduce her blindfolded husband, Kinesias, teasing him.
Right.
And why don't we play that? Really sexy.
Thank you. Well, we have a great deal of help from Laquita and Josh, I would argue. They were beautiful singers.
And Michael did a beautiful job.
Yes, Michael.
We had him on the show recently, and it was delightful talking to. Let me ask you, as a librettist, why are you taking away my job? Now you do, you do your own libretti, and how did this come about?
Well, I trained as a playwright actually before I trained as a composer. I really, in a certain way, if this would be a truer question if you were a composer saying, why do you take away my job? Because I had been writing long before I had a piano. And the great surprise to me was that having trained as I trained, really to follow more in the Sondheim footsteps, of being sort of a lyricist, a composer for the theater, that coming as late as I did to music, that actually that I learned as much as I did. The only reason I say this is because I think all of us who do not grow up in the bosom of concert music, if you will, tend to mystify it a little bit. And I was one of those people who thought that unless you had written your first folio of piano sonatas by the time you were 10, that you would know
Unless you were Mozart.
Unless you were Mozart, precisely. And so even as I did a lot of the things that people do in order to train as composers, that is to say, get the degree in composition and write music and learn all those skills, I still somehow thought that I wasn't going to be a composer per se, because there was such mystique about it. But I had written forever, And I had I started acting and writing plays when I was 10 and 12, first in community theater, then in high school. My major at New York University's dramatic writing program was in playwriting, more or less with a minor in music, although the degree was not set up to officially call it that. So the great surprise was when I went to Washington to finish my composition degree, that when I did my recital, that musicians whom you would thought would have known better started commissioning me as if I were a real composer. And of course, by the time I finished my degree, I was longing to do all of that, but that longing took the form of, well, I know that in the theater, Bernstein, for example, orchestrated at least half of Candide and West Side Story, so maybe I could do my own orchestration or my own vocal arrangements, but still not in the sense of composing an opera. I was still very bashful about that. I have learned to be less bashful about that now.
Traditionally, and this is an old tradition, poets were supposed to be the best librettists, and I find that extraordinarily strange when the skill required is really a playwright skill.
Right.
More.
You know what's interesting about this conversation? Because if you look at poetry now, it's quite removed from what the needs of musical drama are. But when people say poets, they were generally talking about strophic forms. Do you know? Right. I mean, so what we think of, see, poetry has moved away from the skills that it used to have in common with lyrics, and when people say poetic, what they mean in today's terms is musical. They mean some sense of symmetry, of strophe, of the feeling, not necessarily of rhyme, but at least of how the oral spoken qualities of language both contain or suggest music within themselves and work with music as it's actually sung in the room. So in a certain way, I think that John Ashbery, as a poet, would not make a particularly good librettist, because so much of how his poetry works, and it is poetry, but it's very little musical. Because it is it's so freely put together, it's so charged that even if you're reading it out loud, the meaning is not going to present itself at the time that you're hearing it in a way that the best lyrics need to. This is where the Sondheim influence has been so salutary, because what a lot of his work coming from Hammerstein has been very, very little poetic, almost prosaic, really, in its metaphor and simile. The language itself is not terribly rich, but is extremely intelligently formed for music. Rhyme, shape, strophe. And I think that's why we have this memory that the libretto should be poetic, but it should only be poetic technically. As a piece of writing, yes, absolutely, you need the playwright more than the poet. You can do without a poet, but you really can't do without a playwright. No, you really can't.
That's my experience, too. I would love to hear now something that makes me cry when I hear it. I don't know if we can get through this without crying. Is Lysia's realization that she will lose her man.
This is the first piece I wrote for the show. This, in many ways, is the core of the opera from which everything else.
So the prime mover of the sex strike realizes the price of her self-assertion. And what I love about that, it shows the price of politics in a tangible, human way.
I mean, if I can just sort of set this up before we run the tape, because it's kind of useful to underline this. In the original play, Lysistrata comes on stage. She has a fully formed political consciousness. She knows what's right. She teaches us, we're done. I've kind of, the most radical change in my libretto is that Lysia in my opera actually fakes a political consciousness just to wreak revenge on her lover, the Athenian general. And so it's really in the scene that we just saw before, the Myrrhine and Canisius scene, that scene actually peaks with Myrrhine giving up her own personal happiness for the sake of something larger. And so she is actually doing the real thing that Lysia has only been faking. And it's actually that scene that leads to Lysia finally realizing, right at the moment when it's still possible for her to give up the sex strike, get what she wants, and let the cause down, that she can't do that. She started out not caring, and now she can't not care. And that's what this scene is. And this is also Emily Pulley in a radiant performance.
Let's hear it.
there's an angel in this part. An angel in it.
It's an extraordinarily beautiful aria, and it harkens back to the glory days of Italian opera for me. And
I guess it turned out really to be a scena. It's an 8-minute scene.
It is a classical scena. And which composers have I have to ask you, which composers have influenced you most?
Well, other than the one I live with?
Yeah. John Coriano.
Yes. Gosh. Well, I started really listening to the theater composers. Sondheim, Gershwin, Bernstein, in their more operatic modes. So not so much the Gershwin of Lady Be Good, but Porgy and Bess, of the I Sing, Let 'Em Eat Cake. And then I started listening to the people to whom those people had been listening, which would have been the great kind of French and Russian composers of the 20s, Ravel, Britten, Shostakovich, and then it kind of went from there into back into Monteverdi, who in a certain way did more with 6 chords and 4/4 than anybody should do. It's really hard to believe how good that music is when you consider how limited the palette was at that point. And then you just start listening to the more I started listening to concert music, there wasn't one particular composer, probably other than John. I knew and loved John's music before I ever knew him. But you start getting a sense of how to work with timbre from people like Penderecki and Crumb. You get a sense of how to build a kind of gleaming, ostinato from some of the minimalists. I guess my harmony is still more French than anything else. I mean, there are moments, there are pieces in Ravel that I just feel that you could take the entire 20th century and contain it with it. Well, but Britten, Ravel for his basic material, Britten for his economy and technique. You listen to something like A Midsummer Night's Dream, and you can make peace with the fact that it's a masterpiece, but you cannot make peace with the fact that it's a masterpiece and that he wrote it over the summer. It took him 3 months to write that piece. He must be stopped.
Right.
But it's been, at this point, you kind of listen to everything, and then it works its way into your ear and your mind, and with any luck, it comes out. It comes out you. I mean, the curious thing, for example, is that in writing this piece, I was quite sure that a basic sonority had come right out of The Rite of Spring, which I hadn't heard in a long time and had never really played, but I just thought, oh boy, I'm not even going to. Let me just develop this, and then let me go back and listen to Stravinsky, because I know I'm going to have to change it, because I'm sure that I've stolen it, but I don't quite know from where. And I finally listened to it, just waiting, and thought, oh gosh, this is a completely different piece. Which was a great relief. But it goes to show how your ear changes. You tend to think of, you really don't have a very clear perspective on how your music sounds. I guess it's like an actor knowing I suppose asking how your music sounds is like asking an actor what his or her personality is like. You don't know, you're in it. So there are things that I've thought that people would hear influences from other people in it, and nobody ever does, or they hear something else, which is great.
I'm wondering what your creative process was like during the creation of this piece. I kind of saw it at a distance, and periodically I'd see you tear your hair out or slide in and out of your studio. But what was it like for you?
Well, I always start, or always, in these 2 operas, I've started them both the same way. Kind of goes back a little bit to your libretto composer question, because if you're doing something as big and as arched and as complex as an opera, and you also want the illusion that the words and the music are both driving them at the same time. You don't want a play that happens to be underscored, and you don't want a symphonic design that is specified with language like cloves on a ham. You want them all to be fused. The question is, how do you sketch the piece without relying too early on either language or music? And so, for me, what I do is I outline it from the point of view of the actor first, which is to say, first to figure out what is the piece about. Can I put the entire process or question or terrain of the piece in the form of a question? if in Little Women it was why must things change, in this piece it was am I my sister's keeper, if you will.
Right.
It's another way of saying to whom do you belong, yourself or the world. So you have that first. I can't really move without having that. And then I do a kind of outline. I just sort of made this up. It was drawn a little bit from Uta Hagen's book, Respect for Acting, in which she talks about mapping out a role in a play as a design of actions. And she calls her marked up script her acting score. And so I wrote an acting score. I put like Act 1, Scene 1. And I said, I'm going to just write a series of sentences. They all have to contain an active verb, except none of the verbs of language, to ask, to say, to reply, are fair play, because I didn't want to rely on language. I want them short sentences. They can't go any wider than the width of the page, because I thought that's how I'll keep it simple and clear. And then I will pretend that the opera is complete, and I'm sitting in the theater, and I don't speak the language, but because it's staged in front of me, I am getting from the actor's body language what's going on. And that actually, it's sort of a silent movie outline, if you will, and it gives you such basis on which to specify not only the basics of who comes in and what are they saying, but I mean what the actions are that are going to recur and build not only the performance, possibly the musical structure of the score. And so, you know, you write that outline and you send it by every smart person you know. You might have gotten that outline at one point.
Right, I did.
But then the thing is, based on that, then you say, okay, now I'm going to do the opposite. I'm sitting in the theater, the opera is written, I don't speak the language, and I'm blind, but I know what the actions are. What is just the orchestra, or just the vocal registration, or timbres? What are they telling me about these actions, so that if I didn't ever speak the language, I would still have some sense.
Hold that thought.
Okay.
Because they're telling me we have to wrap up this first part.
Oh, okay.
It has been a great pleasure.
But I can move my hands, presumably.
Yes, you can.
Okay.
A great pleasure to connect with you today.
Oh, it's a great pleasure for me as well.
And I'm looking forward to continuing this very conversation.
Okay.
About the rest of your meteoric career. Thank you, Mark Adamo.
Don't say meteoric. Meteors crash.
And
thank you, Bill.
Studio and home audiences for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon for further conversations. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Bill.